We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Find the podcast at bookedonrock.com. Exclusive videos, blogs, links to all of the social media sites, the latest rock book releases, and links to all the listening platforms. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of one of the best-selling albums ever, The Who's classic 1973 album, Quadrophenia. Returning to the podcast to talk about the album and his brand new book titled The Who and Quadrophenia is veteran rock journalist Martin Popoff. You can hear all of Quadrophenia on the show notes page. Hey, Martin, welcome back to the podcast.
Yes, thanks again, Eric. Very cool. The Who. Any day we talk about The Who's going to be a fun day. So.
Hell yes. We're talking about Quadrophenia, and this brand new book is called The Who and Quadrophenia. So it covers the album, but beyond that, it's also the before and after, but really specifically on Quadrophenia, which is an album that I guess, it's about to turn 50. When did you first hear this album in its entirety? What was your reaction when you first heard it?
Boy, it's an interesting question because I think I started with The Who a little bit late. I would have started around Face Dances in a serious way because I was basically your angry young metalhead. Everything had to be heavy. The Who was like some old band, and they sounded old always. They always sounded a little more unraveled versus the stuff that I was listening to as a kid. So I started, my horizon started widening around 79, 80, getting out of high school, getting into first year university, kind of thing coming up. And so I was a big weird Who fan who's coming in at this time when you're not supposed to like the Who very much. Face Dances, It's Hard. I was into both of those quite a bit. So Quadrophenia came quite a bit later. But, as I went back and listened to all this stuff, I mean, even Endless Wire is an amazing record to me. And that's one no Who fan wants to defend that one. So I really like those later albums and the Pete Townsend solo catalog, especially around Empty Glass and All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes. But this period going back, and I'm not even particularly much of a Who fan of anything particularly Tommy. I'm a 70s guy and forward sort of thing with the Who. So yeah, I love this record. I mean, as a concept album, I think it's a much better concept. Tommy always creeped me out. I remember seeing that, as a kid in the theater, and I was too young for it. It was just all these creepy, weird rock stars and this drug use and all these lights and everything. Yet the whole thing seemed kind of dark. It was actually filmed kind of dark too, dark and grainy. So yeah, it's funny. I think I gravitate to this more, and also as a big Jam fan and just sort of a fan of that whole mod movement. I just really like this story. I think it's just a really good, solid story. It's by far the best sort of conceptual thing I think Pete has ever done.
Okay, well, that's what I was going to ask. How do you compare it to Tommy?
Tommy's just too psychedelic and fragmented and old and just too much going on. It's confusing. Lifehouse was confusing. Iron Man was confusing. So I just think that the idea that he had was to base something a little more in reality. I think the story is linear enough and easy enough to understand. I love that it comes from his own past because the Who were basically the high numbers into the Who, into the trying to make a documentary about this scene. I mean, they were essentially the number one mod band. Obviously there was the Faces and the Kinks, and then as we move into Northern Soul and all the stuff that the mods incorporated into what they were doing. But the Who, with the bullseye and the Union Jack and everything, they were the mod band. So Pete has absolute credence and credibility to be talking about this story. So yeah, I just think it's a really good. It's a really good, solid story. At the time, it might have even been too soon to talk about the mod thing, because the mod thing was really only 8 years previous sort of thing. And it's interesting that you allow a little more time to go by, 6 more years, and people are a little more receptive to this mod story, and you get this minor mod revival, although it wasn't much of a revival at all.
Yeah, let's talk about that mod concept. What is a mod? Like, where did that originate? And what is the significance of that in Quadrophenia?
Yeah, so it's a bunch of different things. It's a fashion scene from the sort of like the Italian cinema, the Italian fashion thing. So it's these suits, tight suits, dressing snappy, being sharp. These kids trying to basically there's a little bit of a depth to it in the forsaking of rocker culture and alcoholism and your parents and drinking. So it was more of a, we're going to stay sharp. We're going to take these uppers. We're going to take pills and stay up all night. So it was an amphetamine and speed sort of culture as well. But so on the fashion sense, so you had that, you had the the lifestyle, the staying up, the dancing thing, the being into music thing, the being into soul and knowing about, American records and music and being an audiophile. But then it was also the fashion thing with the suits, and then also like the parka situation. Then you had the scooters, right? The whole scooter thing, scooters were really affordable. I believe how it worked. I can't quite remember, but I believe how it worked is that they were either both cheap to license and cheap to park, and cheap to buy, these, Lambretta scooters and Vespas and stuff like this. So it was a scooter culture. And then on the scooters, they would put on all the extra lights and all the extra mirrors and stuff like that. So you would trick out your scooter. And then the rockers were the ones with the motorcycles. So there was this mod culture versus the rocker culture, and they clashed. They were different things. Mod was more in the city culture, and the rockers were more like from the outskirts sort of thing. The rockers were into 50s rock and roll, and the mods were into, I guess, building on this soul thing, but creating their own rock and roll with the Faces, the Who, and the Kinks sort of thing. And then that all, with the Who being there, this all comes into, Pete basically writes a story about his own past and kind of the birth of the Who, but mod culture at the same time.
It's also a modification of the term schizophrenia. So quadrophenia means the character also, they're parts of each of the four members.
Yeah. So essentially what happens in this is our main character, Jimmy, he sees the Who. He's going through a whole disillusionment with the whole this whole mod situation. He has some setbacks. He basically he's fighting with his parents. He realizes he has to get a job, and he gets a job as a dustman, like a garbage man. He sees the Who. He's kind of disillusioned with the Who, but then he's following the Who. It's kind of a love-hate relationship with the band, and there are elements of his personality in him. And in Pete's story, he represents that by having like a theme song per each guy, kind of thing. And then as the story progresses, he wrecks his scooter. He revisits the glory of Brighton and the big Brighton, the beach riots sort of thing. He realizes that one of the mods that he looked up to is now just a lowly bellboy. And then he goes through, it's interesting, at the end of it, there's this ambiguity that's left with the story in that, does Jimmy commit suicide or not, or does he have a reckoning, or does he decide that he needs to grow up, sort of thing. There's the whole album's overcast. The whole scene is overcast. There's a really nice booklet that comes in the album that has a lot of pictures that helps you along with the story. There's the lyrics. There's a little bit of a kind of explanation by Pete in there as well. But yeah, at the end, he basically kind of pilfers is probably a better word for it than steals. He takes this boat and rows out to the rocks. The weather's bad, there's waves and all this stuff. But then does he return? What happens when he returns, which is different from what happens in the movie. So yeah, to answer your question, yeah, it's pretty neat. Schizophrenia, Quadrophenia. It's a really neat sort of title that they put on this thing. And it's like, is Jimmy a composite of these guys? And is Jimmy basically influenced by other people because he doesn't have much of a personality of himself? So he's seeking himself through all these disillusioned, looking back and realizing that the mod thing wasn't as magic as he thought it was.
And how about the album cover? Is that Jimmy on a scooter on the cover?
Yeah, that's a really neat shoot there. And yeah, the whole shoot for the booklet, everything was expensive on this, right? And then later on the movies, expensive and rushed and all that as well. But yeah, the booklet itself was a pretty expensive shoot, and it looks like a movie in itself. So that's him there. And you've got the nice, really cool, dramatic black and white look of it, and you see the mirrors, and then you also get the reflections of the members of the guys from the Who in the mirrors. So you've got the whole double, triple, quadruple meaning of Jimmy and the mirrors,
symbolism.
He's in there, and he's in these songs. So yeah, very, very cool album cover as well.
The music overall, obviously, we have Love Rain or Me is on there. The Real Me is another one that's a classic rock radio staple, I would say, or close to that. The ending of it, that can you see the real me? You noted in the book that's all his multiple personalities. I thought that was interesting that you noted that. I never even thought about that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, there's a lot of, the funny thing about this album is it doesn't have any massive hits on it. Right. The big Who anthems. The Real Me is definitely one that you would pick out. I don't know, maybe a 515, I guess, suppose as well.
Oh, yes.
You hear
some
of these songs
515,
on, you hear, and I don't like horns in my Who arrangements. I could do without John Entwistle ever bringing that stuff in, but the Real Me is kind of a big one. Wasp covered it later on, right? But yeah, the big dramatic closer, Love Rain or Me is kind of the big one in here. I really like I'm One. I mean, I'm a sucker for Pete's voice and his writing and these mellow acoustic guitar songs. But the music overall in this album, it's a bit of a funny one. I find it to be really sober and level-headed and conservative. I like that quality, and I don't like that quality at the same time. This is a very uniform album. The production on it is workmanlike Who. It's like not particularly dynamic. It's pretty mid-rangey and workmanlike. I mean, most Who is like this, I suppose. Although I think Who by Numbers has really good production on it. But yeah, it's for a double album, it really has this unity about it. And I like the way that they haven't really broken things into, what you get in concept albums, short spoken word things or short instrumental interludes. I mean, it's basically a bunch of songs, and they all stand together really well. There's only 2 instrumentals on it, which is kind of good too. You've got Quadrophenia and the Rock on here. Yeah, I find the album to be one that people either put it at the top of their Who rankings when you do these shows, because it is such a big statement and it's a really good, solid story. But people are not, I think even the people who put it at the top of their rankings are not putting it there because of a bank of particularly amazing songs. People generally can't remember the songs that well off of it. It's more because of the grand statement of the thing, and that it is a really good, solid story. But yeah, it's one that, and then a lot of people will be intimidated by it and not put it particularly high. But Who's Next is generally the album that wins. I think there's pretty much a consensus on that.
It didn't do very well in the beginning, or it did well, but it's actually gotten more popular over the years with the fans and the critics. I do remember seeing the tour in '97 when they brought back the Quadrophenia tour. There was a slow build on this album. For some reason, it wasn't received as well as it's now looked back on today. At least I don't think. I don't know if I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem was, on tour, these songs are unfamiliar. The story's unfamiliar. As Pete likes to complain, the story was a little foreign to American audiences because this whole mod thing didn't happen in America at all. And then, the band was in rough shape. There's a lot of drugs and alcohol still. Yes. It was very stressful. There was, they were experimenting with tapes. You had to play to tapes, and sometimes that stuff screwed up, and that drove Pete nuts. Yeah, and then I do love this whole mod revival situation. In the book, the book is a big, to make a book on one album, you have to have some preamble and some postamble and all that stuff. And I really enjoyed doing the stuff on the mod revival situation, because the mod revival basically came down to two things: the Quadrophenia movie and the Jam. There wasn't really much besides that. From the Jam, it goes way down to smaller bands like the Chords and the Purple Hearts and what's a Secret Affair. But really, there really wasn't much to speak of, and most of it wasn't that good. I mean, I like the Chords. I love the Jam. The Jam is amazing, and the Jam predates the Quadrophenia movie, but the Jam even got, I think a good slingshot effect from the movie. But the movie was well done, well received. Sting is in it. Sting, plays the ace face guy. That got a lot of notoriety and credibility for it. But the movie is just really well done. And of course, they do a Quadrophenia soundtrack album. Keith just died. There's a lot of storyline there to go with this whole situation. I believe around that time, you get The Kids Are All Right. You get a lot of compilation sort of stuff coming out around this time. It's a bit of a confusing story. And then they're quickly back with Face Dances, right? So. But yeah, you get the soundtrack, which is a little, it's basically the Quadrophenia album with a few pretty material changes. But the movie itself was really well put together. It has kind of an alternate ending to this. It's got the dramatic, where Jimmy is like, obviously distraught, and he's riding his scooter towards that cliff, and then you see the scooter flying off in slow motion sort of thing, and you wonder what happened. So it's kind of like it's got that parallel with Pete's story, in that he leaves it in a nice semi-ambiguous place, and the movie does the same thing, but it's a different sort of ambiguous place. There's a little hope to it still, right?
Yeah. Was this when things start to crack within the band? In other words, they're not getting along all too well. This is, I think, the album where didn't somebody throw a punch at Pete, threw a punch at Roger, or vice versa?
Yeah. There's a lot of fighting going on. There's problems with Keith. There's problems with money. There's problems with management.
That's the other thing. Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp. Yeah.
And the studio thing, there's a lot of growing pains there, and there's the stories of Pete being out with his dad, getting found sounds, getting seagull sounds, right, and all this sort of stuff, and waves. But yeah, basically the problem is these guys, unfortunately, they had pretty big egos, I would say. It's almost like they're inheriting that whole cream mantle from the 60s. All of them are acting like and feeling like big rock stars, essentially. Especially, I would say Keith and John. Pete's definitely a real creative, like he's just a genius, but he has those tendencies as well. He has the ego tendencies as well. I think Roger does. So they're all fighting, and they're just spending money like water. I mean everything they're just spending. They aren't really keeping track of how where the expenses are going. They're doing the studio at the same time. 72 was a pretty inactive year. You've got the crossover with working on the soundtrack. That the Tommy situation is happening there. You've got a couple of songs. You've got Relay coming along, but just to keep the band together. So this whole album was it's still a whirlwind of activity and trauma and drugs and alcohol and money being spent, and the record company not being run very well, and they're trying to make this double album. There's technology. Pete's in there being a pioneer with these various synthesizers in his house and stuff like that, right? And so he's coming up with things that are new, and things are breaking down all over the place. But they get the record out and they move on. We don't see another record from them for 2 more years, right?
Yeah. Ramport Studios, right? Battersea, London. Construction is literally going on while the band is recording. Literally, like
Yeah, exactly.
banging
And there's
hammers.
you reminded me there's the big water leak situation where water pours in through the roof and all this stuff, right? So yeah, there's a lot going on, but yeah, they get this out. And I mean, I guess fortunately, like I say, I almost feel like what held this together is that the story was linear and structured and easy to understand, and it just kept them moving from point A to point B on the thing. And yeah, I just think they come out with an album that is the strength of it is more so the story than the music. I mean, the music is essentially, the one thing I say about the Who all the time, and I think I did a podcast episode of my History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff on bands that were I think I called it bands of individuals, right? And the idea is that the Who are almost like the poster children for the idea of when you listen to the Who, it's like you're listening to four guys that are in four separate corners of a very large room. This is not a unified army of a band. They
How do
aren't
they
putting
make it
forth.
work though? How are they able to make
Well, they make it work
the
because
sum is bigger than the parts?
well, usually when the sum is bigger than the parts, you are thinking of something that comes out as a unified force. So this is more like it's more like all of the parts are interesting, and you can listen to all the parts on their own. You've got this drummer who's kind of like a Bill Ward figure in that he's clumping things around the guitar parts, and he's kind of playing lead drums. One of the funny stories, and it's mentioned in there, but the way Keith's drums were arranged, like he would have a row of tom toms and then a row of tom toms behind those tom toms, rather than everybody else puts them in a row, no matter how many of them they have. And one of the guys, I think it was John, described Keith's drumming style as skiing, because like pushing your poles like this, so he'd have to go forward to toms and back to toms and forward to toms and back to toms. So you had Keith doing that. You had John as legendary as a super busy bassist. You had Pete, who is kind of like a noisenick on the guitar, but he made kind of like polite small noises, whereas Keith was making a lot of noise and John was making a lot of noise, but Pete was almost like a hummingbird or a robin or something with his noises. He was like little darting noises and stuff. So he made licks more than he made riffs. He played rhythm guitar and he played licks, but he didn't particularly ever play riffs. That's the funny thing about Pete. And then obviously he's a co-lead vocalist. He's the mastermind of all this stuff. Beautiful acoustic guitar on this album as well. Yeah. And of course, he's this pioneering crazy mad scientist synthesizer. And then you've got Roger on top of it all with his hauler. Roger's kind of like he's got this very distinct, but it's a gruff voice, but he puts that gruff voice into different gears. So you get that out of him. And he is famously the actor who's acting out these words, and Pete's somewhat writing these words even for this actor, who is Roger. So that's the funny thing, and you are getting that across this album. But when I think of all these songs as a conglomerate, I can't help but think there's kind of a uniformity that happens over time on them, where you're not feeling the same chaoticness of styles or volume levels that you feel on other Who albums. Or granted, I think you're feeling a lot of that because of you're getting, a lot of Who albums over time, and you're getting different productions and things. So the Who from pre-Tommy is a very different band. It's more of like a twee 60s band, even though they can make a lot of noise. But yeah, I think you get the Who signature all over this album, but it's compressed into a little less of a dynamic range of that craziness, a little off the top, a little off the bottom.
Yeah, I'm still amazed. I think of Led Zeppelin too. I'm amazed though that you have four individual, extremely talented guys, and they could come together to make a song that is as good as they are, because I would think that the song sacrifices because of it, but it works. It works. It's amazing.
But you know what, Eric? I really wonder if the Who's songs are that good. It's almost like it's almost a little more like jazz, where we are looking at the performance and we're focusing. We want to watch this guy this time we listen to this song. Next time we listen to the song, I'm just going to listen to that guy. A good buddy of mine, Ralph Chapman, said that one of his music teachers once, and I thought this was a great comment, that when you're analyzing an album, you should go through an album that way. Go through the whole album, listen to just the vocals. Go through the whole album, listen to just the guitar solos. Listen to just the drums. Listen to just the production. And it's almost like when you listen to The Who, you can do that with these songs. They come together, but it never feels like a perfect puzzle. It feels like a lot of the bolts and screws are loose all the time. Mm-hmm. So Who songs just kind of clank down the road. And it's super charming, but I wouldn't say there's a massive strength of song. And I wouldn't say there's a massive strength of production. I don't think you ever get unity. You just get this charming four-headed beast clanking down the road. And that's what's interesting about The Who.
We mentioned The Real Me. I'm always zeroed in on John Entwistle on that track. That's my favorite Entwistle track. Yeah.
And I believe that's one of these ones where, well, I'm sure there's a lot of this on YouTube, but you can go listen to people just play those. I think I remember
the isolated tracks.
Yeah. Isolated, or you get a guy sitting down and playing perfectly those parts, and you go, wow, that is super interesting what they did there, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but that's a perfect example of this whole thing, about how it's just this weird four-headed thing of people seemingly pulling in different directions, but they do have somewhat of a blueprint to get them from A to B, and they have to do it.
By the way, I found the skier quote. John, this is from your book. John contributed one of the more insightful things about Keith, saying that Keith had two sets of toms because he moved his arms forward like a skier versus left to right like a normal person.
Yeah.
Is he the first drummer to not keep time necessarily? Is he the first to do that in rock and roll?
I don't know. I honestly, I kind of feel like you get this out of Mitch Mitchell and Ginger Baker anyways. And then Keith is right in there at the same time doing this. I mean, you watch that, what is it called? Railway Club, that amazing footage of them, when they were, Kit and Chris were thinking of doing this documentary thing, and you see the footage of that band, and it almost reminds me of the Damned, Rat Scabies. Rat Scabies doesn't like when you compare him to Keith Moon, believe it or not. But I mean, he does seem Keith Moon-like to me, but he was a super explosive guy always. So, so he's one of them, but timekeeping, I guess timekeeping is something that happened more in pop in the 60s, but it became more in fashion, I suppose, when you get into 70s. So that's why as a kid, The Who always sounded kind of old and hapless, right? Just like the Rolling Stones sounded like a little bit, you look at them and go, oh, aren't they charming, making this silly small twee music and not really getting much of anything right, but everybody loves them, and they're a huge band anyways. And The Who, I kind of feel that way about too.
The guys in the band were not happy with the sonics of Quadrophenia. What were they unhappy with? I mean, in the book, you say you wouldn't even notice it unless someone points out the problems. Is that just a musician thing where they're hearing things that nobody else would?
Yeah, it's 1973. There are better sounding albums. I mean, The Who they're kind of like they're a band from the past already at this point, and they do sound old school. There is Dark Side of the Moon this year. There is Montrose this year. There are some really good sounding records, right? So I think it does sound old for its day. But it is so uniquely The Who. It's pretty similar to me to Who's Next, and like I say, I think Who by Numbers does sound better. But even up into Who Are You, Pete maintains that ethic. I mean, I think he maintains the ethic of analog sounds, capturing John Entwistle a certain way, capturing Keith Moon a certain way. I think it changes for Face Dances, and it's hard where you have this significant change in the drummer, but I think he still records modestly. I think Empty Glass still sounds modest. All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes, on the other hand, is a very high fidelity album. I think that's probably the first totally uncharacteristic album you get out of him, where he's really trying to be ambitious and sound very modern. But if any of the particular members don't sound great on this album, I don't hear it. I think Pete captures himself fine with electric, with acoustic, with the synths. I think Roger, there's no problem with Roger. I think Keith, to get Keith sounding good, I think you have to not do anything too crazy with any of the sounds, not the bass drum, not the toms. His toms always did sound a little flat and cardboardy, but I think you have to do that because he's hitting so many different things. I think the cymbals sound fine. And I think, generally speaking, you get a good buzzy John Entwistle sound on here as well. So there's really nothing really to complain about on it.
It's just a musician thing. Musicians are perfectionists, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously all through this whole thing, they had various things to complain about, but everybody's tired, everybody's hungover, everybody's drunk, right? So there's, there's always going to be problems.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. This is the opening verse to the track, The Punk and the Godfather. You declared you would be 3 inches taller. You only became what we made you. Thought you were chasing a destiny calling. You only earned what we gave you. You make a really interesting observation in the book, and I'm going to read it. He's a next-level music fan that sees himself reflected in The Who, talking about Jimmy, although he's not exactly the bigger fan. Really, that makes sense because he's not all that much a fan of himself either. He's cagey enough on music to see the band's strengths and weaknesses, and he sees through the fame and realizes that much of rock and roll legend making is based on lies. To me, that sounds like Pete Townsend talking about himself, the band, and the Who fans all in one song.
And it's interesting. I mean, I've noticed this with fandom in general. It's like the more you become a fan of a band, you eventually cross a threshold where you find yourself mostly just complaining about that band because you've had so many of the stories, shot down about, I notice this with Kiss fans a lot, right? There are mega Kiss fans out there that know everything. And soon as you know everything, you find yourself basically complaining about a lot of it. Metallica fans, Van Halen fans, it's all kind of the same. So that's a neat thing about Jimmy. He thinks he wants to be a rock star himself. But yeah, then he, bring in the don't meet your heroes thing, all that sort of stuff.
Or like Wizard of Oz, you pull the curtain back and it's this little old guy and you realize, this is all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's cynical or realistic.
Well, and the other thing about Pete, I think that's kind of interesting is that he is such a creative. And I think he's one of these guys who realizes you really have to put in the time, you have to put in the hours. So, if there's a, he thinks what he's doing and rightly so, is very serious. And, you hear the apocryphal stories of the Marshall stack situation, the invention of the Marshall stack, where it's like people were talking too much and not listening to what we were doing. So I had to be louder, right? Kind of thing. But I think Pete also, would dispel the notion that it's all inspiration, because there is a lot of perspiration that's got to go into it as well. So he's the guy just quietly toiling away, inventing things when he has to and coming up with all this stuff. He's absolutely one of my rock heroes. He's I almost look at him as more of a literary genius than even a musical genius, but he has to do all these musical things. He's the ultimate musical director, that's for sure. He's that kind of guy. But also, I think what's really important about Pete is just what he does lyrically. I mean, I often, if I was forced to rank Who albums and Pete albums all together, I'm pretty sure I would put Empty Glass at the very top. All the Best Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes, and then some Who albums would start showing up.
Do you think Roger Daltrey, and this could have changed over the years from the start of the Who to now, because I think he views his relationship with Pete differently now, but it had to have been frustrating for him to have to rely on Pete Townsend to come up with the music and the lyrics.
The whole story of Roger, I mean, I just that is a conundrum to me. I just feel sometimes like I look down on people when they're not writing their own lyrics and stuff. Like I feel this way a little bit about Elton John, with Bernie Taupin kind of doing it all, and it's always bothered me. I don't like when people do a lot of cover songs either. So it does bother me that he didn't write more. I kind of wish he would write more, because I'm always distracted by a lead singer who is singing somebody else's words, right? The fact that he's an actor and he's a singer, generally speaking, it seems sensible that people have jobs. They have certain jobs in bands, and this just wasn't one of his jobs. But I kind of wish he was more involved as well. John Entwistle he can be pretty involved, right? And he can write lyrics and he can sing, and he's the so-called genius with arrangements, right? Brass arrangements and things like that. He can play multiple instruments, but I don't know. When I hear Pete talk about Roger, I feel like sometimes it's a case of she doth protest too much sort of thing, where he's trying to put even more light and depth and into intellectual sweat into explaining Roger's role than there really is. Like he tries to paint it as this magical I have this great persona that I'm writing for, and I'm speaking through Roger and all this sort of stuff, when it's more like you're kind of the guy, just you're the genius behind all of this stuff, and Roger's kind of this mouthpiece there. So I don't know, I'm ambivalent about that whole thing, that when I hear Pete talk about Roger, he's trying to increase the level of Roger's usefulness, and almost like there's a savviness of doing that, because there's only two of them left, and when they go out as the Who, they're just those two guys. But Pete is just so much more integral to the creative part of it that it's always kind of bothered me.
Yeah. Do you like any of Roger's solo work?
Not particularly. There's a lot of covering going on there, and again, there's a lot of not writing going on there. So,
After the Fire was a hit, but Bryan Adams wrote it.
Yeah. It's more the Pete stuff more than anything, and even the Pete stuff, I coalesce. I come down on those two albums and White City more so than some of the conceptual things and Psychoderelict and Rough Mix with Ronnie Lane and who's what is it? What's the first one called? Who's First? I think so. With the one reason in the boiler suit thing, right?
Right.
But the funny thing is with Pete, it's like there's so much to explore, because there's so much crossover with the Who, and that happens with Scoop and all this archival stuff, right? That basically, you're kind of reminded through these crossover, these overlapping albums that Who songs are Pete songs and Pete songs are Who songs, and it just takes like switching out or switching in one or two members, and all of a sudden it's something else. But so much of it is basically Pete, and yeah, I just love that that this story is so relatable and interesting, and it's got little sub narratives and subplots in it, but none of it is too complicated that you can't figure out.
Martin Popoff back on the podcast. This time we're talking about his brand new book, The Who and Quadrophenia. Let's talk a little bit more about John Entwistle. Dr. Jimmy. That's a classic Jekyll and Hyde story. When Jimmy drinks that gin, the monster comes out. A reference to John Entwistle?
Yeah, I've heard that about John for sure.
I never knew he was that much of a partier until he passed away, and then people taught all these stories, because he's a really quiet, reserved guy.
And having all those bases and the materialism, and he just seemed like your ultimate rock star with all kind of the bad rock star habits.
Yeah, and he couldn't stop. He could not stop. That was what Pete Townsend said. We wanted him to just finally, get to that point where, like, I'm past all that, but he couldn't.
Yeah, and the ostentatiousness, and having to have surrounded by riches all the time, and yeah, I think he had a big ego on him as well. I don't like most of his. A lot of people have a soft spot for his, Boris the Spider and all these kinds of songs, right? But I've never really liked his material that much. I like sort of the the morbid sense of humor in that, but when I listen to those John Entwistle solo albums, I'm just not into them.
Let's wrap it up with the last song, Love, Rain O'er Me. Only love can make it rain. Those 6 words spell out the moral of the entire album, you say in the book. What is Pete Townsend talking about here? Only love can make it rain.
To me, it's almost like the weird thing about this story is it's not about love at all, really. I mean, it's got a slight sub narrative with a love interest in it, but it's almost like Pete's putting a layer of his spirituality on this whole thing. Mortality, immortality, not so much immortality, but mortality. I just feel like there's unfinished business. He's a very spiritual guy. He's spiritually sort of conflicted, but it's not particularly an album about love. But yet he ties it up with this, and he just at the very end almost like adds an extra layer of complexity to the thing.
What's this about Quadrophenia suffering from the great polyvinyl chloride shortage of late 1973, early 1974?
I recall here I've had people like Alice Cooper and Geezer Butler tell me stories about the vinyl shortage as well. There were albums that were delayed coming out. You couldn't get reprints on.
Yeah, it was hard to get a copy of Quadrophenia when it first came out because of it.
Yeah, this was all during the whole, OPEC crisis and all that, right?
Yeah, OPEC caused oil crisis and exploding demand for PVC piping and construction.
Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's all these nooks and crannies, like I say to the book. I mean, I'm looking at the table of contents right now, and you've got, like I say, a lot of preamble about the mods. I've got separate chapters on each of the guys, so little profiles of the guys, and then whole chapters on each of the sides. But yeah, as you get up to it, you've got the movie, you've got the soundtrack album, the mod revival, chart sales and rankings, tour date archive, and the tour gets super complicated because, like you say, they keep coming back with these things. The Who post-Quadrophenia, the modern day stuff, collectibles, discography. It's complicated discography as well. You've got eventually the, there are a lot of research materials used to make this book, but I mean, Pete does an amazing job because he's a writer himself, and he was an editor at a big publisher as well. But he's written a lot of things himself. His autobiography is one of the best that there is. But they did an amazing, massive immersion box set for Quadrophenia as well, where he put a lot of good information in it. So yeah, it's got a complicated history, tour wise and release wise. That's for sure.
Managed a number 2 placement in the UK and America, held off back home by David Bowie's Pinups covers album, and in the US by Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Yeah. You hope that readers come out on the other end of the book with a new appreciation for Quadrophenia. Did writing the book do that for you?
Definitely. And that's what I like about these books on one album. I've only done that with this, and I did it with Dark Side of the Moon also for Quarto. I love this publisher because Dennis over there is a big music guy himself, and he does a lot of the work on all the images. I've kind of helped on that on this one as well, but they do a beautiful, beautiful job of the layout and pictures and stuff. But my whole point of why I like these books on one album is it basically comes out as the ultimate set of liner notes, right? When you're sitting down, because really the only physical product I really appreciate and like and go out of my way to buy these days is massive immersion box sets, hopefully on one album sort of thing, because I love just getting immersed in the whole story. And that is what makes you appreciate these albums more when you are sitting there, analyzing every little sound, every lyric, the whole background of it. And like I say, this has got a complicated background, even with the shoots for the booklet. And then there's a whole movie, right, to go with it. And there's all the differences between that. So yeah, definitely. I think there'd be absolutely no chance that you wouldn't get a new appreciation for the album by sitting and reading the book at the same time as you're listening to the album.
I'm curious as to where you would rank this album among other Who albums, but also among the greatest concept albums of all time.
Wow. So I would probably put it as my favorite Who album.
Really?
But I'm pretty close with Who by Numbers, and I think I would weirdly be pretty close even with Face Dances and Endless Wire, which is shocking.
Really?
But
Wow.
I just love Endless Wire to death.
Do you really? I like Endless Wire.
Yeah, it's such a rule breaking album. It's so strange. It's got the weird little mini opera thing in the EP adjunct, and Pete singing like Louis Armstrong, and it's got songs that are strange arrangements and little clips that recur later on. It baffles people, right? For some reason, that album just always connected with me. And in terms of greatest concept albums, wow, it literally might be my favorite story-wise. Although, another one that I really love is Fear of a Blank Planet by Porcupine Tree. That is an amazing story as well. And that's Stephen Wilson wrote a story about, the music's incredible too, but I think that's the height of the Porcupine Tree catalog, and that's saying a lot because that's a great catalog. But that album is about just kind of the lost generation of English kids, stuck on the internet, stuck on their their attention deficit disorder, drugs, just feeling dead inside, kind of thing. So that's a really interesting concept album as well. So I would actually put that as a better album overall than Quadrophenia. Even that's a masterpiece, that one. How about yourself? What can you think of?
Dark Side of the Moon to me is the best that I've ever listened to.
Yeah, I'd put Animals. It's
universally relatable to everybody. I mean, there isn't one person who can't relate to the themes that are on that album.
I mean, I even wrote a whole book on Dark Side, which just came out, but not too long ago, because that's also the 50th anniversary earlier this year. But I prefer Animals. Animals is I love Animals. I like Animals even more as a concept album, so that's a good one.
By the way, it's awful to have to even say this, just for those who may not know, because people don't listen to new music anymore. Endless Wire was from 2006. That's Pete Townsend and Roger post Entwistle's death. Yeah. And what did you think?
Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, I'd put pretty high.
Oh, yes. Yes.
But oddly, so if you want to contrast it with this one, it's almost like that's a very daunting one because nobody can figure out what the story means. That's the problem with that one. Music's great. But yeah, it really falls down on the story. It's just too strange. But yeah, that's one that a lot of people will point out for sure.
Kilroy Was Here by Styx. You don't put that.
Oh yeah. People always laud, Operation Mindcrime, but I'm not a massive Operation Mindcrime fan.
Right. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of some of the other ones that might be. Operation Mindcrime is one. I'm looking through a list here, but
I'm drawing a blank. What do you got on the list there?
Yeah, let me see here. Greatest concept albums of all time. Let's see what we can find here from youdiscovermusic.com. Give them a free plug. Peter Hamill, Nadir's Big Chance, Transatlantic, The Whirlwind, Jay-Z, American Gangster, The Pretty Things, SF Sorrow. Boy, they got some. Well, Green Day's American Idiot.
Yeah, that was a big one. Joe's Garage, I appreciate that whole thing.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how they
Clockwork Angels, right? Rush.
Yeah. I like Joe's Garage, how they came out with Joe's Garage. I think it was called Act 1, but then soon after you got an album that was a double album that was 2 and 3 together. So but musically that's not very good. I think I like the Thingfish is bizarre. Thingfish is crazy. I really like that one though.
You're a fan of the Jam, right?
Yeah.
Setting Suns, 79.
Yeah, they didn't really particularly have a concept. Man, they are so good. I love the Jam. I love the Jam more than I love the Who. But yeah, those albums are absolute masterpieces. So they're a mix of the Who and the Kinks almost, right?
Yeah.
They're a little more of the whole working man kind of thing, right?
Could put Wish You Were Here up there by Floyd.
Yeah, I would put that super high. I'd put The Wall super high. I'd put Amused by Death pretty high. I'm a big Roger Waters fan as well.
Oh, we can't. Well, the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah. Although that's
And
pretty
Bowie's The
loose.
Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust. That's another one.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that.
Have you ever done an episode on concept albums on any of the podcasts?
Oh, I'm sure I've done various episodes on either our YouTube channel, The Contrarians, or History in 5 Songs. But it's funny, you're reading that list and it's like, wow, I guess I didn't really forget too many great ones because that list isn't coming in too hot, with a pun. I'm not going, oh, I forgot about that one.
Right.
I don't know. You got a longer list there? You got one with like 50 on it?
Yeah, I bet you Rolling Stone has a 50
50
list.
or 100?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think.
And while I look that up, what did you think of the last Who album? Because I do like that one, I think, more than Endless Wire, personally.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously more conventional. It's broken into songs. It's a little rockier. It's a little more Who-like. Yeah, I think it's a pretty darn cool album.
Beads on One String is brilliant, beautiful. I love that song, Beads on One String.
Yeah, definitely good album.
50 Greatest Concept Albums of All Time by Rolling Stone. Let's see. Kilroy Was Here by Styx. They have it 50. A lot of XTC albums. I didn't even realize they're concept albums.
I can't think of a single XTC album I would call a concept album.
Yeah, they got Queensryche's in there, Operation Mindcrime. Drive-By Truckers, Southern Rock Opera from 2001. 42. Halsey, If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power. Rolling Stone does they like to make sure they include recent.
Yeah, they're being pretty contemporary with that, right?
Elton John, Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. Number 41.
Yeah, not a fan. Not an Elton fan.
I mean, Tony Braxton and Babyface at number 39 with Love, Marriage, and Divorce.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, I guess. The Mountain
I'm
Goats.
looking around my office at all these band things. And
well, how about Welcome to My Nightmare? Alice Cooper is a
pretty good.
classic.
Pretty good. Yeah.
They have that at 37.
He did From the Inside. He did Welcome to My Nightmare. He did Dragon Town. He did a lot of conceptual things. The Temptation of
Iron Maiden, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
Yeah, not a very good one and pretty loose. That's the one, the famous, Bruce Dickinson told me, and that quote's used all the time, but I interviewed him. He remembered saying, when that came out, I listened to Operation Mindcrime and I had my head in my hands saying that's what we should have done, and we blew it.
Yeah, you mentioned the Kinks. The Kinks are the Village Green Preservation Society.
Yeah, they've done a few, but they aren't my favorite Kinks albums. I like more your Kinks from the late 70s and early 80s. Those are my favorite Kinks albums.
Yeah, they do have Lamb Lies Down on Broadway at 23.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brian Wilson's Smile is a concept album. A kaleidoscopic tour of American pop tinged with whimsical humor that was nearly 40 years in the making. Brian Wilson.
There really aren't that many, Well, Jethro Tull. Okay, so Thick as a Brick is a good one.
Yep.
I really like Thick as a Brick.
They have Quadrophenia at number 18 on Rolling Stone. Running on Empty, Jackson Browne concept album.
Right.
Okay. We're getting to 14. Oh, Radiohead, they have a Kid A at number 14. David Bowie, Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, 13. Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, 11. Sinatra in the Wee Small Hours at number 9. Wow. The Concept, former teen idol, hits 40, watches his relationship with a fellow celeb crumble, and cuts one of the first and most depressed concept albums. My Chemical Romance, Rush 2112 at number 7.
Which is only half a concept album, right?
Yeah.
The other side is not concept. Yeah.
The Who, Tommy at number 5. The Wall, number 3. Green Day, American Idiot, 2. And
that was
the number 1 concept album of all time, Kendrick Lamar. Get Good Kid, Mad City.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we really didn't forget too many.
No.
Just literally aren't that many good ones. No.
The Who and Quadrophenia. It's available September 19th. So it's not out yet. It will be out soon, wherever books are sold. And people can find you online, your web address.
Yeah, martinpopoff.com. Basically anything that is in print, I keep copies. I'm a retailer of my own stuff. I sign them all out from here, and there's PayPal buttons there for Canada, US, international. But yeah, if it's in print, I will have copies. I'll have these, sooner than anybody kind of thing. And I'll be selling them, signing them, and selling them.
All right, Martin. Well, look forward to having you back again soon. It's usually sooner than later because you are, as they say, prolific.
Yeah, thanks again. This was a lot of fun.
That's it. It's in the books.